Now I want to introduce one of our, I think of her as a star. I mean, she's been here 30 years. She has really created the textiles program. She's been a tremendous force for building the department all these years, taking care of her students, having a vision for her own, kind of a special vision in her own world of textiles. And by the works you see in the other room, you can see it's pretty amazing stuff. So without further ado, Lisa Lee Peterson.
Thank you all for turning out. I'm glad it's not snowing yet. I also have some thank yous, so let me get through those. First of all, I want to thank Liz and Carrie for letting me have this slot. I asked for it. It's my swan song. And then inviting me to speak. I also want to especially thank Liz for all of her assistance. It's a big job hanging the show. And then I abandoned her last Saturday and left her to hang the whole show herself. You see a lot of Chinese in the room back there, and I don't read or speak or write Chinese. And so there are a lot of people who helped me with that. Alice Wang, is Alice here? Dilling Young, who is the wife of the former dean of the School of Engineering, he is now the chancellor at UC Santa Barbara, but the piece straight ahead of me, I actually emailed Dilling out in Santa Barbara and asked her if she would calligraph that. She is a master calligrapher. And Lucy Xie is my latest, my newest Chinese consultant. So any Chinese that you see on the weavings or even in my talk today is thanks to them. I'd also like to thank my writing partners, Astrid Hastak and Mary Jane Vandor, whose cogent commentary continues to sharpen my writing skills. My daughter, who is here today and also in the weavings, she's back in Lafayette. She didn't go to undergraduate here. She's working on her PhD in interdisciplinary life sciences. If you want your children to be scientists and engineers, you have to be an artist. My father was an engineer, so if you want them to be artists, you have to be an engineer. Anyway, she has the dubious honor of rescuing her mother every time she does something silly like starving her brain of oxygen, which is what I did last Saturday. And last but not least, to my husband Clifford, who is both intelligent and artistic. I don't know if you've read that piece yet. Who allows me the space to write, either because he's on his tractor or making his own art, and who is my unwavering companion in all things. So, Lisa Peterson, I'm just going to aim this thing this way. Lisa Lee Peterson Textiles, I haven't been weaving at all recently, unless you count knitting. But I've been writing stories. But etymologically speaking, I'm still weaving. And let me show you some words. So, textiles and text share the same Indo-European etymological roots. The Latin root T-E-K-S means to weave or to fabricate, and from those words we get text, texture, context, pretext, and so on. The Greek word tekton means carpenter and builder, and from that word we get architect. Greek techne is art, craft, or skill, and we get the word technology. So watch out, I'm taking over everything. And one more thing, the Latin root tila is root for words like web and net, the jargon of electronic media today, and finally warp, which are the vertical threads on the loom. And interestingly enough, the Chinese words share the same etymological connection. So this is the Chinese word for warp. It means jing, it's pronounced jing. So you can see it means warp, these are the threads on the loom. But a very ancient book from about the 12th century BC, one of the 5 Confucian classics, the I Ching, the Book of Changes, change and book. And so let's share all of the same roots. So I'm still reading, but I'm writing. Each Shoots and Weaves is the title of my piece, and before I go further, I remember that I promised I would explain to you how these pieces are made. I wasn't going to talk about the technology or the actual weaving of it, but I think many of you are interested in it. These were woven on a computer-assisted jacquard loom. A jacquard loom is a device, or jacquard is a device that is part of a loom that operates the patterning mechanism of the loom itself. And we have a computerized one here. Some of these pieces were woven on that loom. And normally, on just a regular little hand loom, you have 4 threads that you can tell what to do. And so every 4th thread does the same thing. But on this loom, I have 1,700 threads. So I essentially have, a grid, 1,700 pixels wide and as long as I want it. And so I can tell every single thread what I want it to do. And so I take a photograph, and I have to program the weave structures into it and the multi-layer. So I have to understand how to build a fabric and the structure of the fabric. But then the computer and the loom run the patterning mechanism. The pieces are still hand-woven. I am still throwing a shuttle across, beating it in, throwing it the other way, beating it in. But it's boring as can be. You just become part of the machine. When I weave, I like to do things with it, and so many of these pieces were woven by someone else up in Montreal. I just sent them the program, the yarns, and the instructions, and came back. So I wasn't there doing every single little spot that you see in there. So did that answer everyone's questions about how it was made? Okay. So back to Each Shoots and Weaves. The title, first of all, comes from, it's a parody of Lynn Truss's book on punctuation, Each Shoots and Leaves. The panda bear up there on the ladder is painting out the comma because if you put a comma there, it means that the panda bear goes into a bar, eats something, shoots someone, and then leaves. But my title actually intends the commas. The first 2 characters here are pronounced "turku," which means to eat bitterness or to endure hardness, hardship. So these pieces are really about me looking like an Asian person and people saying silly things to me because I look like an Asian person, and we'll get to that later. So it's kind of what happens to me inside is I feel like I get denied my identity. I identify as an American, but people in America think that I'm Chinese. And so the next piece, 2 words, is in she, which means to, shadow and shoot, to shoot and shadow. So, these issues that I have, I'm really just I'm shooting at shadows. They're not really there, they're only my own demons. And the last word is really not a verb, it's not weaves, it's weaver, so that's me, the weaver, even though I'm not weaving. So it's about me growing up American but looking like I'm from somewhere in Asia. I should say that any self-respecting Chinese person will tell you that I am not Chinese. I might be from Asia, but certainly not Chinese. It's because I don't speak Chinese, I think. Anyway, I've been told that in China. You're not Chinese. You don't even speak the language. So I'm not going to show you all the pieces, but I did want to show you Truth and Lies. Truth and Lies is the one that's hanging up just opposite this wall and not against the wall. It's meant to be seen from 2 sides as a metaphor that every story has 2 sides to it. It's called Truth or Lies because many people over the course of my marriage to my husband, we've been married 32 years, have asked us whether I met my husband in the war. War? What war? Skip in the war? They must have the wrong person. And then it's like, oh my God, they think I'm a war. So I've written many stories about how I met my husband in the war. The shortest one is that he met me when he was resting and recuperating in a Bangkok brothel. And saved me from, death. So that's what the weaving looks like. It was woven so that both sides were good, so you can go around and see the other side. That's the piece that Liz had to hang by herself because I left. 5 generations of virtue record my family's diaspora 5 generations away from China. This is not really my great-grandmother. She's a stand-in. My cousin sent me this and said it was my great-grandmother, but she has big feet, so it can't be my great-grandmother. But anyway, it's fine. It also points out the 4 virtues of the virtuous Chinese wife. So the first virtue is virtue. I'm not sure what virtue means, but that probably means that you don't sleep around with other women. It doesn't apply to men, just the women. The next one is propriety in speech. This is my grandmother, who has had her feet bound. You can see her little tiny toe here. Her shoe is out, her full shoe is out there. I'll talk about that in a minute. Anyway, propriety in speech, which means always say yes to your husband. The third one is physical appearance. Of course, you have to look beautiful. And finally, me, diligence in housework. Alice Wong gave me the last one, which is my daughter, the 5th generation, and she's none of those, and she's not going to have anything to do with that. She's the accomplished young woman. Yes. So the diaspora, my great-grandmother immigrated from China to the Kingdom of Hawaii in the 1880s. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was born in the Kingdom of Hawaii in 1886. My mother was born in the territory of Hawaii in 1920. I was born in the territory of Hawaii in 1950 can't be right. It must be, it's probably 1970s. My daughter was born in Indiana in 1988. Just a little bit about my grandmother. Today I'm going to talk to you and read a part of a story that I'm writing about my father's mother, but this is my mother's mother. She is someone who was very much a part of my life. Her name in Cantonese, her last name is Chun Sao Chan. I think in Mandarin it's Liu Xiu Zhen. See, the Chinese people can read. The first part of her name, this is her last name, the first part of her name means clever, but also intelligent without seeming so. Isn't that typical of how women have to be? Propriety in speech. She's the one who taught me to cook and to sew, which is of course the 4th virtue of the virtuous wife. Unlike my paternal grandmother, my father's father, she did have bound feet. They were bound by her mother when she was a child, and they were 3 inches long. My aunt had her wedding shoes, and they got lost, which is too bad. I have her shoes from later in life. When she married, my grandfather allowed her. He said he didn't need the status of a wife with bound feet. I know we've heard the stories about, it was a sign of beauty, but it's really, I think it was just to sort of hobble the women, keep them from leaving the house. Anyway, he didn't need that, and he allowed her to unbind her feet, which was probably a process as painful as binding. But they did grow to a length of about 6 inches, and I have her handmade ostrich shoes found in the album. Oh, there she is. Oh, yeah, again, she was born in the Kingdom of Hawaii in 1886, so not in China, but her feet were still bound. They banned it shortly after that, so her sister's feet are. Okay. When I met my husband 32 years ago, we only knew each other for about a month before we got married. So there was, we had to look through family albums pretty quickly and learn about each other. And this is my family. So let's see. I know my mother gave me 2 sets of letters when back up. My father died about a year and a half ago, and when he died, my mother gave me 2 sets of letters. One set were my father's letters. Here he is with his U.S. Army aviation engineer khakis. My uncle was in the U.S. Navy. Uncle Walter is a graduate of Purdue. So, this is my family photo album, and my husband has a similar family photo album, both about 1945, 1946, both all men coming home from World War II. This is my husband's grand uncle, or great uncle, quartermaster in the U.S. Army. This person. And he's also a Purdue graduate, as is my husband's mother. All these Purdue people. I put those together, 4 mothers commemorating the same event in the U.S. So the question's always, I have the same history, I have the same American history, but I'm still considered Chinese. So this was another family album picture of my husband's father and grandparents and aunt. The father came from Sweden in 1911, grandfather and grandmother from Sweden in 1916. My grandfather, I think, came to the to Hawaii, so it was the Kingdom of Hawaii. In the late 1880s, early 1890s, he was, came to steerage, worked in the sugar plantations, stuff like that. My father, of course, was born in 1915 in the territory of Hawaii. And my grandmother was born in 1894 in the Republic of Hawaii. There was the kingdom, a short-lived republic, and then the territory of Hawaii. And she died when she was quite young, so I never knew her. I need to move my page. And again, the question is, since these people came, this woman was born in, well, not Hawaii, but in the land that became territory of Hawaii, and she became a citizen in 1898 when it became a territory. And my grandfather also became a citizen in 1898. So which family is more American? And I put this together in 4 positives. I want to go back, though, to this person. So I never knew my grandmother, my father's mother, and I had all these questions when I was growing up. How was she when she married? And it was always, she was an old maid. And I said, well, what's that mean? She said, 24. And if she was born in Honolulu, what was she doing in China when she got married? Because she had to be brought back from China to Hawaii to marry my grandfather. And my father had no idea. Well, how old was she when she died? She died young, 43. Turns out she died when she was 41, and of an enlarged heart. He knew that. And then my father would say that she was never happy, and I said, well, why? He didn't know why. She wanted something better in life. She wanted to have this fancy life, and she couldn't have it. When my father was 12, my grandmother gave birth to her second child, an aunt, and then that aunt was 8 when her mother died. So she never had any real mother, and I guess she didn't behave correctly because my mother, couldn't stand it. My aunt was the bane of her existence. And whenever I misbehaved, which was not very often, my mother would say, "You're just like your aunt." And so, in my child's mind, I translated that into, oh, my mother's going to drop dead when I'm 8 years old. When she didn't do that, then my mother's going to drop dead when she's 43, which was the age of my grandmother. She didn't do that. I'm happy to say that my mother is 94 and still going strong. I taught her how to knit a Mobius strip this Thanksgiving, and she's been knitting away. She likes watching Oprah, Jeopardy. Anyway, so my aunt. This is my grandfather's name, Jack On Lee. Anyway, again, he emigrated from the Canton province, China, to the Kingdom of Hawaii in the late 1880s or so, when he was 12 or 13. He worked off his labor contract in the sugar plantations and then apprenticed himself to a tailor. The little midi suit that my father and my husband's father were wearing, anyway, the midi suit that my father was wearing is one that my grandfather made. But when my mother died, so there were two sets of letters. One set of letters were the love letters from World War II from my father. The other set of letters were letters from my grandfather, written primarily to my father, but sometimes to all of us. And they reveal things, answers to my questions that I was asking all my life. And so my father and mother had these answers, but perhaps they didn't understand the significance of what they were saying. So this is an undated letter, and at the top it says, "Your mother died young, and you blame me." My grandfather went to school in China until he was 11 or 12, I guess, and then came to the United States. He sprinkles his letters with a lot of Chinese. They're pretty clear. He knows all the little strokes, and I can look them up. And I think that at some point he must have gone to sort of a business English school, because some of his letters are very formal. But he doesn't have any punctuation. Lynn Truss would be very unhappy. Then the rest of the letter, part of it said that she was sent to China in 1902 to marry when she was 10. And she returned to Honolulu in 1912 when she was 19 to marry. And she was very ill for 3 years. And my father wasn't born until 3 years after they were married. So, 1902. So now I have a date as to when she was sent. Another letter is dated. It's January 11th, 1963. And this one starts out the same way. Your mother died young, you blame me. But then he adds a little bit more information. Because she was born in Honolulu, all the young men hung around her, knowing that if they could marry her, then they could come to Honolulu. Some of the words are, he uses, you can tell that he's had some Chinese, because he uses words, English lessons, because he uses words like enmity and requite. And I don't think that they had a very good marriage relationship. I'm looking for this. It's not easy. But anyway, they had a terrible life, but he says, but I take it and I eat it. And then later on at the bottom, he says something that is Confucius. He's quoting Confucius. He puts it in Chinese as well as in English down in the corner. And essentially it says, you don't want someone to do that to you, you don't do it to someone else. Anyway. Okay, so this is my grandmother's name, J. Ferry Chung Yoksen, and it's in Chinese, in Mandarin it's Chung Yu Xian, so J. Ferry. She was born in 1894, and the reason I know birthday in 3 different ways. According to the Western calendar, the Republic of China calendar, and the Chinese system, the Chinese zodiac. And none of them quite correspond with each other. Lucy and I were trying to figure this out. And so I decided to go with the Chinese system because, I mean, that has to be right, right? So my grandmother was born in the year of the wood horse in 1894, which would make her 8 when she was sent to China. Last year was another wood horse, so it would have been her double 60th anniversary, a very auspicious time, celebration in Chinese ritual. Of course, very few people make it to 120, 60. So, as my grandfather's letter attests, she was married off for her U.S. citizenship. You know, all the young men hung around her hoping to try to get, oh, I'm jumping ahead, sorry, let me go back. So, she was born in 1894. In 1895, Sanford Dole, the self-appointed president of the Republic of Hawaii, passed a law banning foot binding. And back then, among the Chinese community, if a woman didn't have bound feet, you couldn't get her a good husband. But something else happened. Then in 1898, the United States became a territory of Hawaii, and my grandmother became a U.S. citizen. Interestingly enough, also at that same time, when they became citizens, all people of Chinese ethnicity were required to carry along with them a certificate of residency to prove that they were American citizens. Does that sound familiar? I thought history wasn't supposed to repeat itself. And then there were the Exclusion Acts, which excluded Chinese immigration. They had finished the railroads, they didn't need them anymore, they didn't want them. 1882, 1892, and the last one, 1902, made it permanent for all time. No more Chinese could come to the United States. And so 1902 is the year she was sent back to China. So it's that when her father realizes that she's valuable property, she can be sold for her citizenship. So she's 8 years old, and she gets shipped off to China. It's also a good way for her to get a wealthy marriage, a wealthy husband, because she was married in what is called a minor marriage in the late Qing dynasty. In English, it's translated as a virgin-raised bride. Wealthy families would buy a girl anywhere from birth to about 8 or 10 years. So my grandmother was just at the end of that period when they would do that. A wealthy family would buy a daughter, and then when the children were old enough to marry, consummate their marriage, then they would marry. So it was a way for him, one, to get a good marriage for his daughter. So she was born in 1894. She became a citizen in 1898. She was sent to China in 1902 when Chinese were excluded. By the way, that ruling was not lifted until 1965. The census in the United States in 1960, there were 250,000 Chinese. My family was among those. The census in 2010 was 3.8 million, a 1,500% increase since 1965, 50 years. So, I understand why people think I'm Chinese, lump me together with all the other people. So one more thing happened when she's already in China, and then something terrible happens. It's 1907, and the United States passes yet another law. This is the Expatriation Act, which means that any American woman holding American citizenship, if she marries a foreigner, she will lose her citizenship. Now, men could do that. Men could marry foreign women and keep their citizenship, but women can be taken advantage of. So here she is, 1907, belonging to this other family, expected to marry. She's only 12 years old, probably hasn't reached puberty yet, so they aren't married yet. And she suddenly becomes worthless. So her dying in 1935, I left off one page. She came back in 1912 and married my grandfather. And she was 18, hardly an old maid. My grandfather was 33 when he married, so he was 15 years her senior. My grandmother was only 41 when she died, and so none of us knew her except, of course, for my father. And so these are the only facts that I have about my grandmother, and some are from my grandfather's letters, and others are from the research that I've done, historical research. And ever since I read those letters last summer, I've been working on a story about my grandmother. And if we have time, what is it? What time is it? 1 o'clock.
You keep going, you're doing fine.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I can stop.
No, please go.
If you have to leave, I'm sorry, please do. I wanted to read a little bit of a story from you, but I don't have to. I can just sort of run through it very quickly. So why don't I just give you an overview of it. I was going to read you an excerpt of what happens to Jade Ferry when she's 8 years old and she arrives in China and she's about to meet the man that she's going to marry. And do you want me to read it to you? Sure. You want me to read it to you? Sorry. So she's been told all these stories that she's going to marry this prince of a man and he's going to come back to Hawaii with her and buy her this palace with a household full of servants. She's quite happy. Now all of this is fiction, you realize, because I know nothing. I only know those facts. So she's about to meet him for the first time. And the character of New Mother is the first wife in the household, the most powerful woman in the household of her adopted family. Once again, they traveled down long corridors and past many interior gardens. How large is this house anyway? One of these days, Jade Ferry said to herself, all of these hallways and courtyards will be familiar, and I will know how to get from one place to another without having to follow a servant or ask directions. New Mother always had a servant at her side, not to guide her from one place to another, but to support her as she tottered along on her bound feet, making sure that the old woman didn't lose her balance and fall. As they walked, the route seemed familiar. It was, in fact, the 5th time Jade Ferry had walked in counting the comings and goings, but she hadn't paid much attention because she always had someone to follow. When they arrived, she realized that her small room was part of a suite of rooms that were her new husband's living quarters. This alarmed her. Will my husband-to-be live so nearby? Are we to be married right away? I'm only in my 9th year. Jade Ferry entered his room. When she entered, she saw that the man, who was to be her husband, was holding hands with another woman. As if he had been kept waiting for her arrival for far too long, he was hollering and tugging to be free of the woman's hand, anxious to be off and running. His head was shaved bald except for a bit of fringe on his forehead. Jade Ferry, New Mother said, this is Dai Dai, younger brother. The top of Dai Dai's head barely came up to Jade Ferry's waist. So this is the man, Jade Ferry thought. The man who will someday be my prince of a husband? A baby? She assumed that the woman holding his hand was his nursemaid. But when New Mother informed Jade Ferry that from that point forward, she was to take care of Dai Dai, the nurse let out a stifled gasp. New Mother made a gesture, flinging out the fingers of her right hand that silenced the nurse immediately. Jade Ferry asked the nursemaid how old Dai Dai was. He's 19 months. Dai Dai finally managed to loosen his little hand from the nurse's grip and dashed out the open doorway, chortling as he went. New Mother jerked her head in the direction he fled, glaring at Jade Ferry until she too tore out of the room, running after him. If New Mother smiled, it would have been one of the very few times that Jade Ferry ever earned her approval. Slowing down to peer down unfamiliar hallways and into empty rooms as she went, Jade Ferry spied Dai Dai in a nearby garden, playing with a fat golden white fish swimming about in a pool of water. He had found a stick and was trying to poke at her. Jade Ferry made her way to the water's edge and sat down on a flat rock near him. She unhooked and removed one of her slippers and gingerly dipped the tips of her toes into the water. Several fish swam over and tried to nibble at him. It tickled her. She giggled and quickly pulled her toes out of the water. Dai waddled over, dropping his stick as he went, climbed up into her lap, and stuck out one of his feet. "Shoo," he said. "Shoo," he said again, flopping his foot as about to get Jade Fairy to take it off. Jade Fairy unbuttoned the strap that fastened the cloth shoe of the proffered foot, and then the other, then placed both shoes on another rock farther away from the water. She didn't want New Mother to scold her for allowing the thick paper inserts lining the sole of each shoe to become sodden with water. Then she removed her other slipper, putting her pair next to his. Tiring of the unrewarding game of trying to eat their toes, the fish swam off, and Jade Fairy rolled up the legs of her pants as well as Dai's, and they stayed on their rock, sunning themselves and splashing their feet in the water. If there were any lingering fish, they swished off now, frightened by the commotion the children were making in the normally tranquil pond. Dai's feet were small, but Jade Fairy's were not much larger. They were at most a big toe length longer, half again as wide, and flatter, not chubby with baby fat. Jade Fairy had often seen her elder sister's naked feet while her maid unwrapped, washed, and rewrapped them with fresh bandages each morning. Her feet were hideous and ugly. They were discolored and swollen, broken and deformed, and they smelled really awful, worse than sewage. It was all Jade Fairy could do to keep from retching. Her elder sister clenched a rolled-out wash rag between her teeth to prevent her from cracking her teeth and biting her tongue, but also to muffle her screams while the maid tightened the bandages. Her feet were being transformed into nothing but big knobs below her ankles, each with a little bit of pointy toe. Jade Fairy could see that her elder sister's feet, brown feet, were far more bulky than Dai's fat baby feet, but only half the length. Her elder sister would never again be able to get around on her own without help. How can anyone think of that brown feet are a mark of beauty in a woman, Jade Fairy thought. The intricately embroidered silk shoes with tiny pointed toes and miniature heels that women with bound feet wear over their bandaged stubs are exquisite and dainty. Just don't look at or smell what's inside them. As she sat with Dai splashing their feet in the water at the edge of the pond, Jade Fairy decided she was glad her feet were not bound, even if it meant that everyone made fun of her and her unbound feet. And I'm glad that I'm Chinese, even though I get made fun of for looking and not speaking Chinese. Thank you very much. Any questions?
What are you doing with your stories? Are you putting them together in a novel or publishing them?
I'm writing this. Since I don't have to do it for a living, I just get to write it. So,
Have you taken writing classes?
I took one writing class with Patricia Henry several years ago, but Astrid and Mary Jane and I have been writing together. I might try to put them out and try to publish them at some point. At this point, I'm just enjoying the writing. Yes.
Why didn't you tell the best story about how you met your husband in the war?
Oh,
Which one is that?
The Chinese Navy story.
Oh, yes. All right. Oh, that's because that's the weaving. Yes. Another story of the way I met my husband in the war is that I was, yes, the answer to the question is yes. I was the captain of a Chinese submarine. I was the captain of a Chinese submarine, and we were doing reconnaissance in the Baltic. And so, we were near the surface, and I set the periscope off. And I spied this cute little sign, but really it's my sewing room. And that's my niece looking out, you know, of my.
Lisa, I have a question. I'm nothing an artist or not having a lot of friends who are artists. What happens when you produce work like this and it's hung for a show? And then what? I mean, it's beautiful work. What happens to that? Do you sell it? Do you donate it? Do you have it in your home? It's really lovely.
It gets rolled up and stuffed in my closet.
Well, I'll come by.
Well, or, you know, if anyone wants a piece, let me know. They're looking for homes.
Okay.